Most people think the global supply chain is leaving China, factories moving to Mexico, Vietnam, India. Politicians call it nearshoring. CEOs celebrate diversification. But here's the provocative question. What if the factory in Mexico still belongs to China? Here's what mainstream analysis gets wrong. They assume geography equals control. If production happens in Mexico, they say the system is less dependent on China. But the numbers tell a different story. In 2023, Mexico exported $475 billion worth of goods to the United States, and a growing share of those exports rely on Chinese capital, Chinese components, or Chinese ownership. Let me show you the numbers that matter. Over the past 5 years, Chinese foreign direct investment in Mexico has surged more than 300%. Not officially, of course. A senior economist I spoke with off the record in Hong Kong told me something fascinating. He said, watch the supply chains, not the passports of the factories. Here's what nobody tells you. When tariffs hit Chinese exports during the US-China trade war, thousands of manufacturers didn't abandon the American market. They rerouted it. Assembly shifted across the Pacific to northern Mexico, but the machinery, the engineers, and the financing often remained Chinese. This is the nearshoring paradox. The system designed to reduce dependence on China quietly deepened it. Most people think supply chains are moving away from Beijing. But here's what's really happening. They're stretching. If you want to understand global manufacturing power, just look at a single example. I visited an industrial park outside Monterrey last year. On paper, the factory produced appliances stamped "Made in Mexico." But when I talked to the floor supervisor, he laughed. He said the design comes from Shenzhen, the motors come from Guangdong, and the financing comes through a Hong Kong holding company. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything. That single plant exported nearly $420 million of appliances to the United States last year. Washington counts it as Mexican manufacturing. Trade statistics celebrate diversification, but the value chain tells another story. Here's what matters if you're trying to understand the real power shift. Manufacturing today isn't about where the final screw gets tightened. It's about who controls the ecosystem, the components, the tooling, the logistics networks, the financing pipelines. And China built that ecosystem over 3 decades. I remember talking to a factory manager in Shenzhen who explained it to me perfectly. He said, anyone can move assembly, but you cannot move 20,000 specialized suppliers overnight. This is the first force behind the Made in Mexico illusion, supply chain gravity. Once an industrial network reaches critical mass, everything else gets pulled toward it, even factories across the ocean. But that's only the first system at work, because supply chain gravity alone doesn't explain why Chinese firms are quietly building entire manufacturing corridors inside Mexico. The second force is even more strategic, and it's the one most Western analysts completely miss. It involves capital routing, ownership structures, and a trade rule called rules of origin. And once you see how that system works, the entire nearshoring narrative starts to look very different. Because the uncomfortable question is this: if the factory is in Mexico, but the strategy is still written in China, who actually controls the supply chain? And that's just the first layer of the story. The second system is even more sophisticated, and it's the one that makes most Western analysts completely miss what's actually happening behind the numbers. Let me show you how that system works, because once you see it, you'll never look at Made in Mexico the same way again. But to understand it, we need to talk about the quiet financial pipelines connecting Shanghai to Monterrey. And trust me, this is where the story gets even more surprising. So here's the question you should be asking right now. Who really owns the factories reshaping North American trade? Because the answer reveals the second force behind the nearshoring myth, and it's far more strategic than anyone in Washington wants to admit. Let me show you next. In the next part, we'll break down the ownership game, quietly rewriting global trade rules today behind the scenes. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently from simple supply chain gravity. It's about ownership, but not the kind that shows up clearly in headlines. Most people assume that when a factory opens in Mexico, it must belong to Mexican companies or American investors trying to move production closer to the United States. That sounds logical, right? But let me ask you a simple question. What if the factory technically isn't Chinese, but the money behind it still is? Here's what nobody tells you about global manufacturing today. Ownership structures are deliberately layered. A company might be registered in Mexico, financed through Singapore, controlled by a holding company in Hong Kong, and ultimately run by executives in Shenzhen. Let me show you the numbers that matter. Between 2018 and 2024, Chinese companies announced more than $13.5 billion in manufacturing investments in Mexico. But here's the part that surprises most analysts. Only a fraction of that money shows up as direct Chinese investment in official statistics. Why? Because the capital often flows through intermediary countries. A senior trade lawyer I spoke with in Singapore explained it like this. Modern industrial investment travels through passports the way multinational profits move through tax havens. By the time regulators look at the paperwork, the origin becomes blurry, and that blur matters because the real game revolves around something called USMCA Rules of Origin, the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA. If a product contains enough North American content, it can enter the United States tariff-free. But here's the loophole most people miss. The rule focuses on where the final value is added, not who owns the factory. So a Chinese firm can ship components from Asia, assemble them in Mexico, add local inputs, and suddenly the product qualifies as North American. This is the ownership arbitrage strategy, and it is happening at scale. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button because this next number puts the entire system into perspective. Chinese auto parts manufacturers alone announced more than $5 billion in Mexican investments since 2020. Companies producing batteries, wiring harnesses, motors, and electric vehicle components are building massive facilities across northern Mexico. But here's the question that should stop you for a second. Why are Chinese EV suppliers racing into Mexico right now? Because the future of the American auto industry runs through supply chains that China already dominates. Stay with me, because what comes next connects to something even bigger. I remember talking to a logistics manager outside Tijuana who works with electronics exporters. He showed me a shipping dashboard on his computer. Containers arrive from Shanghai, components move into Mexican assembly plants. Finished goods cross the border into California within days. He looked at me and said something that stuck with me. The distance didn't change, only the label did. This is the part that should surprise you. According to trade data from 2023, Mexico became the largest exporter to the United States, surpassing China for the first time in 2 decades. Headlines celebrated it as proof that supply chains were decoupling. But here's what matters if you dig deeper. Mexico's imports from China surged at almost the same pace. In other words, as Mexican exports to the U.S. exploded, Mexican dependence on Chinese inputs exploded too. This is the nearshoring feedback loop. Factories relocate to Mexico to serve the U.S. market. Those factories import machinery, components, and industrial inputs from China. Production rises, exports rise, and suddenly Mexico looks like the new manufacturing champion. But behind the scenes, Chinese supply networks expand with it. Let me show you what this actually means. Imagine a television assembled in Mexico. The screen comes from a Chinese supplier. The circuit boards come from Shenzhen. The lithium battery comes from a Chinese battery giant. Final assembly happens in Monterrey. When it crosses into Texas, trade statistics record it as Mexican. But the ecosystem powering that television remains deeply Chinese. Here's the paradox. The strategy meant to isolate China from North American supply chains is quietly embedding Chinese companies deeper into them. And this brings us to something even more uncomfortable, because supply chains and ownership structures are only part of the story. The third force, the one almost nobody in mainstream analysis talks about, involves something much bigger than factories or trade rules. It's about industrial strategy. And once you understand how Beijing thinks about manufacturing geography, the nearshoring boom in Mexico starts to look less like an accident and more like a long-term adaptation. Here's the uncomfortable question we need to explore next. What if China never needed to keep factories inside China to maintain control of global manufacturing? Because the real leverage might sit somewhere else entirely. And when we look at the numbers behind that system, the implications for the U.S. economy become much harder to ignore. Let me explain. So let's talk about the third force, the one almost nobody in mainstream analysis wants to discuss, because it challenges the entire way people think about manufacturing power. Most people believe industrial dominance comes from where factories physically sit. If production moves out of China, then China loses influence. That's the common narrative. But let me ask you something. What if geography was never the real source of power in the first place? Here's what matters. Modern manufacturing isn't controlled by assembly lines. It's controlled by industrial ecosystems, the machinery, materials, technical expertise, supplier networks, and financing structures that make those assembly lines possible. And China dominates those ecosystems in ways that most people dramatically underestimate. Let me show you the numbers that matter. China produces over 50% of the world's steel, about 70% of lithium-ion batteries, and roughly 80% of global solar panel components. In rare earth processing, the number climbs above 85%. This is the part that should surprise you. When factories move to Mexico, Vietnam, or India, they still rely on these upstream supply chains. The machines come from China, the inputs come from China, the engineers often come from China, so the factory moves, but the ecosystem doesn't. When I was in Shenzhen a few years ago visiting electronics manufacturers, a plant manager explained something that stuck with me. He said relocation doesn't scare Chinese companies. In fact, many of them welcome it. Why? Because it expands the market for Chinese industrial inputs. Think about that for a moment. If a U.S. company builds a factory in Mexico, where do they buy the machinery? Often from Chinese equipment manufacturers. Where do they source many intermediate components? Again, Chinese suppliers. The global map changes, but the supply web still runs through China. Here's the uncomfortable truth. China spent 30 years building the deepest industrial base in human history. Entire cities specialize in tiny slices of production. Screws, circuit boards, micromotors, chemical coatings. Tens of thousands of specialized suppliers operate within hours of each other. You can't replicate that overnight. A senior economist in Beijing once told me something blunt. He said, "People think factories define manufacturing power, but factories are just the visible layer. The real power lies in the layers underneath. And here's where the numbers become even more revealing. China accounts for roughly 31% of global manufacturing output, more than the United States, Japan, Germany, and South Korea combined. That's not a round number politicians throw around. It's the actual scale of the ecosystem. So when production spreads across borders, Chinese companies don't necessarily lose influence. Sometimes they gain it because they become the suppliers feeding those new factories. Let me show you what this actually means in practice. Imagine an electric vehicle assembled in Mexico 5 years from now. The battery cells come from a Chinese battery giant. The battery processing equipment was built in Jiangsu. The electronic control units rely on Chinese components. The cathode materials come from Chinese refiners. Final assembly happens in North America, but the technological backbone still runs through China. This is the global manufacturing paradox. The weapon that was supposed to weaken China's industrial dominance, supply chain relocation, can actually reinforce it. And this connects to something even bigger. Because if the ecosystem remains Chinese, it means China doesn't need every factory inside its borders to remain central to the global economy. Influence moves through supply networks, and the deeper those networks become, the harder they are to replace. Here's what makes policymakers uncomfortable. Decoupling sounds simple in speeches, but in practice, rebuilding entire industrial ecosystems takes decades, not years. Which raises a question most governments still don't want to confront. If nearshoring doesn't truly break dependence on China's industrial base, then what does? Because once you see how these three forces work together, supply chain gravity, ownership arbitrage, and ecosystem dominance, the global manufacturing map looks very different. And in the final part, I'm going to pull this entire system together. We'll talk about what I call the shadow supply chain strategy and why it could define the next decade of economic competition. More importantly, we'll explore three possible futures for global manufacturing, and one of them could completely reshape the balance of power between the United States, Mexico, and China. And trust me, the third scenario is the one that should keep policymakers awake at night. Now let me pull this entire system together, because once you see the full picture, the nearshoring narrative starts to look very different. We've talked about three forces shaping what's really happening behind the Made in Mexico boom. First, supply chain gravity. The industrial ecosystems built in China over the past 30 years are so dense that even factories moving abroad still depend on Chinese suppliers. Second, ownership arbitrage. Companies restructure investment through layered ownership, so factories appear local, even when the strategic control and financing originate elsewhere. And third, ecosystem dominance. China controls enormous portions of the upstream industrial inputs, materials, components, and manufacturing equipment that power global production. Put those three together, and you get something far more sophisticated than simple offshoring. I call it the shadow supply chain strategy. Here's what nobody tells you about the modern manufacturing system. Control no longer requires owning the final factory. Control comes from owning the layers beneath it. Think about how the global tech industry works. Apple doesn't own the factories assembling iPhones, yet it controls the ecosystem, design, supply chain coordination, and key technology. China is applying a similar logic to industrial production. Instead of insisting that every factory remain inside China, Chinese firms are increasingly embedding themselves across the global supply network. And here's the number that really matters. Mexico imported over $110 billion worth of goods from China in 2023. That's not a rough estimate. It's one of the fastest growing trade corridors in the world. Let me show you what this actually means. As Mexican manufacturing expands to serve the American market, demand for intermediate goods rises. Machinery, electronics components, chemical inputs, industrial parts. Where do many of those come from? China. So even as the United States imports more finished goods from Mexico, the upstream supply chain often runs through Chinese factories. This is the nearshoring paradox in its clearest form. Most people think supply chains are leaving China, but here's what's really happening. They are rerouting through China. I remember talking to a trade analyst in Washington who said something revealing. He told me policymakers celebrate nearshoring statistics without asking the deeper question. Who supplies the suppliers? That's the question that reveals the real structure of power in global manufacturing. Now here's the part that should make you think carefully about the future. Because the shadow supply chain strategy leads us to three possible scenarios for the next decade. Scenario 1. Managed diversification. The United States, Mexico, and allied economies slowly rebuild alternative supply chains. New industrial ecosystems emerge across North America and parts of Asia. China remains important, but dependence gradually declines. This is the scenario most policymakers hope for, but it's also the slowest and most expensive path. Building a full industrial ecosystem takes decades, not election cycles. Scenario 2, network entanglement. Nearshoring accelerates, factories spread across Mexico and Southeast Asia, but upstream dependencies on Chinese materials and components remain intact. Trade flows look diversified on paper, but underneath, Chinese firms still power huge portions of the supply web. Many economists quietly believe this is the most likely outcome. And then there's scenario 3, the one almost nobody wants to talk about: strategic integration. Chinese companies aggressively expand manufacturing investments across Mexico and other nearshore economies. Supply chains become geographically diversified but strategically interconnected. In that world, products assembled in North America could still rely heavily on Chinese technology, equipment, and components. This is the scenario that should terrify policymakers who believe nearshoring automatically means decoupling, because it would mean the geography of production changed. But the center of industrial gravity did not. And here's the uncomfortable truth: global supply chains are not simply moving, they are evolving. The next decade won't be defined by factories leaving China. It will be defined by how deeply China remains embedded in the systems powering global manufacturing. So the next time you see a label that says "Made in Mexico," ask yourself a deeper question. Where were the components made? Who financed the factory? Who built the machines inside it? Because if you want to understand the future of economic power, you have to look beyond the label. Now I'm curious what you think. Do you believe nearshoring will truly reduce dependence on China? Or is the shadow supply chain strategy already reshaping the system in ways most people don't see yet? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives like this into global power shifts, supply chains, and the economics shaping the world right now, make sure you subscribe. Because the next story we're going to unpack might be even bigger than this one.